Today we will add some enemies and create the enemy AI for our Seraph's Last Stand game, and we will also add some enemy spawning. Let's get started. I will begin just by creating the enemies, so we can right click to the object and create the square. I will change the order in layer. We can make it a bit bigger. I will add box collider 2D to it, and also rigid body 2D. And on the rigid body 2D, don't forget to set the gravity scale to 0, like that. We can create new C# script for the enemy AI and just add it to the enemy. Also, because we will be adding a lot more of the enemies, I will create another script which will be just the scriptable object. So we will be using scriptable object for adding those enemies. If you don't know what scriptable objects are, don't worry, I will show it to you. So the enemy scriptable object script, you don't actually need to put it anywhere, you can just leave it in the project. And the scriptable object we need to derive from the scriptable objects and not from the mono behavior, like this. And we also need to create a set menu, so we can create the instance of the scriptable object. So we can just say create asset menu. I also have a video about scriptable objects on my channel, so feel free to check it out. We can delete all of those voids and we can define some properties of the enemy. So I will add a public float, which will be for the height in which the enemy should be moving, because every enemy can have a different height. Some enemies might be higher above the player, some might be lower. Then I will add public float distance, which will be just for the maximum distance between the enemy and the player. I will add another public float for the health max, float for cooldown of the shooting, and because each enemy can look different, I will also add public sprite, which will be just sprite of the enemy, and I will also add game object, which will be for prefab of the bullet, because each enemy might have different bullets. So I will add public game object and bullet prefab, and this will be all that we will define for now. Obviously we will later define damage and all of that stuff. Now when I right click, I can go under create and select the scriptable object under which I have enemy. So I will create just like level 1 enemy, and I can obviously assign some height, distance and all of that stuff. So like this you can easily create many enemies with different properties. I will jump back to the enemy AI script where we will actually do some more interesting stuff. First we will add public enemy SO, which is variable for the scriptable object, because we will need to take some of the values from that scriptable object later. I will also add public float for the health and public float for the height, because we have the height in the scriptable object, but what I will do, I will make the height a bit random. I will add game object, which will be for the player, then another game object for the bullet parent, where we will just instantiate all of the bullets, and float, which will be just the current distance to player. Now in the start we can just define the player variable, so the player is equal to game object dot find, and we will find the game object called player. Just check that the name is correct. We can also find the bullets, so the bullet parent is equal to game object dot find and the bullets. On the start we can also set the health, and we will take this value from the scriptable object, so the enemy dot health max, because on the start the health will be the maximum health. And as I was saying with the random height, I will set the height to random dot range, and the minimum value I will take it from the enemy scriptable object, so enemy SO dot height, and I will subtract 0.5 from it. And the maximum value will be again the enemy SO.height plus 0.5. That way it is a bit more random. First I will make just rotate the enemy towards the player, so I will create new void. And here we will do the same stuff that we have been doing with the aiming of the player. So we will have some float, which will be the angle, and this will be equal to the math f dot 8 and 2, and we will need to get the player's position on the y-axis, and from it we will subtract the position of the enemy, so transform that position that y and do the same thing with the x. And multiply this by the mathf that radians to degrees. Now we can just set the rotation. Don't forget to call the void in the update. So just assign the scriptable object to the enemy and we can try it. Yeah, the enemy is rotating towards the player. It is just a bit weird, the rotation, so that's why in the script I will just, to the angle, I will add 90 and now it should all look okay. Yeah, this looks better. Also, what you might notice is that when I jump on the wall, you can see that I'm kind of floating when I'm trying to go to the left now. For this I have found a quick fix. All we need to do is just right click, create, and 2D, physics material 2D, I will call this slip, and we can just set the friction to 0 and add this to the rigid body of the player, like that, and this is the easy fix for that. Yeah, now we can easily move on these steps, and the enemy is correctly rotating towards the player. Now we will make the moving of the enemy, which will be a bit more complicated, but it shouldn't be anything too hard. So I will create new void, which will be just move. And in here, first we will calculate the distance to player. So distance to player is equal to vector2 dot distance. We need to import the two vectors. So the first one is the transform dot position of the enemy. And second one is obviously the player dot transform dot position. And if the distance to player is greater than the distance in the enemy scriptable object, which we have defined in it, or the enemy is just higher where it should be, then we will move it. So first is if the height is not correct, I will just set the transform dot position, create new vector 3. The position on the x-axis will stay the same and the y will change. So we need to decrease the y, so I will just say transform dot position dot y minus, and here I will do the mathf dot power. So the greater the distance from the designated height is, the faster the enemy will be moving. Here I will input the distance to player minus the height, and I will add 2 so that there is more space for the movement. And I will also multiply that by some small number so that it is moving slower. I have found that 0.017 is working perfectly. And then just the second parameter, which is the power, so I will set this to 3 and the z will be 0. And what might also happen is that the enemy is below the designated height, so else if the transform dot position dot y is less than height, and I will add here -1, and here we will do the same thing as we are doing here, but instead of decreasing the height we will just increase it like that. Next we will be changing the x position. If the player's position on the x-axis is greater than the enemy's position on the x-axis, then we will do something similar that we did with the height. So we are increasing the enemy's position on the x-axis and the y stays the same, and we will do the same thing if this is not true, so else instead of increasing the x position we will just decrease it. Now just don't forget to call the move void in the update. I have noticed that in the script we actually don't need this if sentence, so we can leave it like this and it should be working better. Yeah, so you can see that the enemy is looking at the player, and when I try to move it, it is trying to move to the designated height and also closer to the player, so you might want to play with the values and with the speeds of movement of the enemy. Now we can see that when I increase the speed, it seems to be working a lot better. We can also try adding more enemies. Yeah, this seems to be working pretty nice. Now I will make it that just when we hit the enemy it will decrease its health. So we will create new void, and this will be on trigger enter 2D. So we can see that we get the collision object that the enemy is colliding with, and we just need to compare the tag. So if collision dot compare tag, and if the tag is bullet, then we can just decrease the health. We also need to add this tag to our bullets. So just find the prefab of the bullet and create tag and add it to the bullet. And one thing that I like about the Seraph's Last Stand is that when you are hitting the enemy, you can see the health based on the opacity of the color of the enemy. So it is changing the alpha of the color like this when you are hitting the enemy, which is the next thing that we will do. In the enemy script, I will create variable for the sprite renderer, which is just handling the colors. On the start, I will set the sprite renderer to the sprite renderer which is on the enemy, so equals GameObject dot get component, and it is the sprite renderer. And now in the update we can just set the color. So sprite renderer dot color equals to new color, and the only thing that we want to change is the alpha. So we will need to get the sprite renderer dot color dot R, then the green, and then the blue. And then for the alpha I will use the mathf dot power once more, and we will input the health divided by the maximum health, which is in the enemy scriptable object, and we can make it of power of 0.7. And also if the health is less than 0, we can just destroy the object. Now the hitting of the enemy doesn't work because I forgot to add the collider to the bullet, so I will quickly do that. And we can set it to its trigger. Yeah, so you can see that the opacity of the enemy was decreasing and it vanished when the health got to 0. The last thing that we will do on the enemy itself is the shooting, which I will do on the update. So if the distance to player is less or equal to the distance from the enemy scriptable object, and the enemy can shoot because there will be some cooldown, I will create the bool can shoot. From start this will be true. So if the enemy can shoot, then we can just instantiate the bullet. So GameObject bullet is equal to instantiate. We'll instantiate the prefab that we'll input in the scriptable object. So enemy so dot bullet prefab. Now we can instantiate it at the position of the enemy for now. So transform dot position. Now the rotation of the bullet on the z-axis has to be minus 90 degrees because of the rotation of the enemy. So I will use quaternion.euler, create new vector 3, and it will be 0, 0, then get the transform.rotation.euler angles on the z-axis and subtract 90 from it. And the parent will be just the bullet parent.transform. Now, how do we know if the enemy can shoot? Well, we will use coroutines for that once more. So somewhere at the end of the script, I will create new enumerator, and when this coroutine starts, I will set can shoot to false. Then we will wait for some seconds, so we yield return new wait for seconds, and we will wait for the seconds that we have in the scriptable object, so the enemy so dot cooldown, and then we will set can shoot to true. And also don't forget to run the coroutine, so when we shoot we can just start coroutine, and this is the shoot cooldown. Now we will make the bullet move, so we can just say bullet dot get component, and we will get the rigid body 2D, and we will just add relative force, create new vector 2 of the force, and we can set the force mode to impulse. Then just destroy the bullet. I will take the prefab of the bullet that I already have, and I will just change the color and create another prefab for the bullet of the enemies. So we can see that the enemies are moving towards the player and they are also shooting, so you could easily change the cooldown. Then maybe we will add the damage property and all of that stuff. And the last thing that we'll do today will be the enemy spawning. So I will create two new scripts. One will be the game manager and also enemy spawn. So just create empty game objects and add these scripts to them. And because those two scripts will be in the game all the time, I will make them singletons. If you don't know what singletons are, I'm planning to make a video on it soon, but what you need to do is just create public static variable of the type of the class of the script. So this is game manager, usually it is called instance, and then we need to add the property to get and private property to set. I will also add a vague void in which if the instance is equal to null, then instance is equal to this, and don't destroy on load this game object. Else, if the instance is not null, then we can just destroy game object. So this is how you create singleton. Again, I will teach you in the later videos. And why I am making the game manager? Because here I will add the most important stuff. For now it will be just public int for the wave, just the number of the current wave. I will also create game object for the enemy parent, because I will need to know if there are some enemies in the game. On the start, I will just set the enemy parent to game object dot find, and in the scene I will create empty game object and just call it enemies. So now in the update, if the enemy parent dot transform dot child count is equal to 0, which means that there are no enemies here, we can just add 1 to the wave, so wave plus plus, and then I will also call some void on the enemy spawn script, but we will need to first add it here. So in the enemy spawn, as I was saying, I will make it singleton 2. Here in the enemy spawn, I will create new array of all of the enemies that can be spawned. So this will be the enemy scriptable object array, and I will call it enemies. Then I will add game object variable for the enemy prefab, because we will have just one enemy prefab, and then we will assign the enemy scriptable object to it, and game object for the enemy parent. On the start we will just set the enemy parent, and I will create new public void, and into parameter I will add int, which will be the current wave, and this will be the void where we will instantiate all of the enemies. So again, don't forget to call it in the game manager, and because the enemy spawn script is singleton, I can just say enemy spawn dot instance dot next wave and call it like this. Here I will first define the enemy count, which again I will use the math power, and I will just input the wave, and the p will be by 1.3, let's say. Then I will create int for the enemy difficulty, which will make it that just the bigger wave it is, the harder the enemies will get. Now create for loop for spawning the enemies. So the int I will be equal to 0, and if the I is smaller than the enemy count, then just I++. First I will define the spawn position, so vector 3, and this will be just random. So this is the x can be anywhere from -10 to 10, and the y from 6 to 8. Then I will define enemy index, which will just tell me which enemy we should spawn from the enemies array. And now we can actually spawn the enemy. So game object enemy is equal to instantiate. We will just use the enemy prefab then the spawn position, just new quaternion for the rotation, and the enemy parent for the parent. Then I will just get the script from the enemy, so enemy AI enemy script is equal to enemy dot get component. Now I can set the scriptable object on the enemy script. And this should be all for spawning of the enemies. Now the last thing I will just add to the enemy AI, that on the start, the sprite renderer dot sprite is equal to the enemy scriptable object dot sprite. That way each enemy has its own sprite. Just select the enemy spawn, and into the enemies array you want to add all of the scriptable objects for the enemies. And also the prefab, which I will just make from this enemy. Yeah, so when I kill the enemy, 2 of them spawn in, and like this I should be able to go forever, so more enemies should be spawning in. Yeah, the movements of them are a bit too quick, so there is definitely a lot of stuff that I need to tweak, but I think it is functional prototype of the game that we have enemies that are spawning in, and they are also trying to shoot the player. The last thing that I will do today is just steal some of the textures from the game once more and add them to the player and also to the enemies. As you can see, I have added more graphics from the Seraph's last stand. It still definitely doesn't look the best, there's some bugs, it needs a lot more polishing, but I think that overall I have made a decent progress in recreating this game. I hope that you liked this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I will see you in next videos. Bye!